Derrida, an Egyptian, on the problem of the Jewish pyramid, read by Saul Nassau with occasional commentary. Preliminary note. Nothing seems more natural than for the living to forget the dead, and nothing is as obvious as the fact that the dead haunt the living. Of all the things said by Derrida with reference to his approaching death in the summer of 2004, the statement that occurs to me most often is the one in which he professed to harbor two utterly contradictory convictions relating to his posthumous existence. He was certain that he would be forgotten as soon as he died, yet at the same time that something of his work would survive in the cultural memory. I guess here we can see that Derrida and Nietzsche and many other philosophers have a similar fate. Many times you hear these cultural idioms that today really belong to Derrida or really belong to Nietzsche, but people don't know of their origins. The two certainties he explained both existed within him in an almost unrelated fashion. Each was accompanied by the feeling of complete self-evidence, and each was conclusive in its own way, without having to take the opposing claim into account. In the following, I would like to attempt to approach the figure of Derrida in the light of this declaration. It seems to me that this statement shows us more than simply a person in his fortuitously contradictory nature. Rather, through its unreconciled positing of two alternately valid observations, it has an expressive dimension that reveals something of Derrida's fundamental positioning, Grundstellung, if I might be allowed to apply that Heideggerian expression ad hominem just this once. A funny conservative joke by Sloterdijk. Derrida's words amount to a self-description that almost has the character of a metaphysical statement. He thus concedes that in the real, whatever that might mean, there are oppositions that are incapable of synthesis and coexist despite being mutually exclusive. Because these oppositions form part of the speaker's own thoughts and experiences and determine him, this concession at once leads us to an observation about the philosopher, that he experienced himself as a place in which the non-unifying encounter between mutually incompatible evidences occurred. This is a jab at Hegelian thinking. One could probably take this observation as a point of departure and ask whether the tireless insistence on the ambiguity and polyvalence of signs and statements that is inseparably associated with the physiognomy of this author could perhaps have indicated that he experienced himself as the vessel or collection point of oppositions, that he refused to join and form a simple identity. Another jab at identity politics here, with the idea of intersectionality failing to fully take on the concepts of complicity and incommensurability. This comment could already provide the main outline for a philosophical portrait of Derrida. His path was defined by a constantly alert concern not to be pinned down to one particular identity, a concern that was no less profound than the author's conviction that his place could only be at the forefront of intellectual visibility. One of the most admirable achievements of this philosophical life is the fact that it was able to maintain the simultaneity of the utmost visibility and a resolute non-identity with any specific image of itself in a shimmering parabola extending over 4 decades of his existence as a public character. There are essentially 2 ways to do justice to a thinker. The first is to open his works and encounter him in the movements of his sentences, the flow of his arguments, and the architecture of his chapters, One could refer to this as a singularizing form of reading in which justice is interpreted as an assimilation to the unique. It would be especially natural choice in the case of which such an author as Derrida, who never wanted to be anything other than a radically attentive reader of the major and minor texts, whose sum total constitutes the Occidental archive, assuming one gives the word reader a sufficiently explosive meaning. The other way is to move from the text to the context and locate the author in relation to a meta-personal horizons that reveal something about his true meaning, at the risk that his own text may be assigned less importance than the larger context in which his words echo. This approach amounts to desingularizing reading, in which one understands justice as a feeling for constellations. Derrida himself clearly preferred the first approach and did not expect any favorable results from the second, as he knew very well that it was especially attractive for those who wanted to make him all too easy to deal with. Hence, when the occasion occurs, he defended himself politely and clearly against Jürgen Habermas's attempt to declare him a Jewish mystic. In answer to this uncomfortable identification, he remarked with subtle irony, "I am not demanding that one should read me as if my text could transport anyone into a state of intuitive ecstasy, but I do demand that one should be careful about mediations and more critical towards translations and diversions via contexts that are often very far from my own." If I have chosen, keeping this warning in mind, to take this second path in the following, there are two very different reasons for this. The first is that there is already no lack of ecstatic and literal, not to say hagiographic readings of Derrida to be found everywhere. The second is that I cannot shake off the impression that, with all the justified admiration for this author, it is so rare to find a sufficiently distanced assessment of his position in the field of contemporary theory. This call for distance is an expression of esteem. Yet this is one of Derrida's idioms. For if one can also understand it as an antidote to the dangers of a cultic reception, it is all the more necessary in order to develop an image of the mountain range from which La Montagne Derrida rises up as one of the highest peaks. In the following, I shall sketch 7 vignettes examining this thinker in relation to authors from recent tradition and present day: Nicholas Luhmann, Sigmund Freud, Thomas Mann, Franz Borcono, Regis Debray, George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, and Boris Groys.